Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending today's Threatpost webinar entitled Enterprise Mobility and Post-Perimeter Security Inside the Evolving Mobile Enterprise Threat Landscape. I apologize that we're getting started a little late here. We were wrestling with some technical difficulties, but hopefully we're back where we need to be. So let me introduce myself. I'm Tara Seals, Senior Editor at Threatpost, and I'll be your moderator today. I'm excited to welcome our panelists. We have a really great set of thought leaders today who are going to give a comprehensive dive into the fast-developing area of mobile enterprise security. There are a lot of challenges in this space, as we know, and that's proving difficult to address them with a legacy security model. So we'll talk a little bit about the top challenges, some best practices for addressing them, and thoughts for the future, what might be coming down the pike. Today, we're going to hear first from Patrick Hevesy, who is Senior Director Analyst at Gartner. He's going to frame our discussion by talking about some of the top mobile enterprise security challenges, and he's also going to offer a pretty interesting framework for administrators to decide how to address them. Next up, we're going to hear from David Richardson, who is Senior Director of Product Management at Lookout. He's going to discuss what they've been seeing in terms of their telemetry and threat intelligence, and talk about some specific threats, real campaigns, and also some best practices for defending against those. And finally, we'll hear from Mike Burr, who is the platform specialist for Android Enterprise at Google, and he's going to address some perceived threats to the Android ecosystem, along with some of the best practices for managing Android devices within the enterprise. Before we begin, I just have a couple of technical notes. First of all, the webinar is being recorded, so we'll be sending out a link where you can listen on demand. You'll be able to share that with your colleagues, friends, neighbors, what have you. Also, we will follow the presentation with a Q&A session, so you can submit your questions anytime during the webinar. Just use the control panel widget that you should be seeing on the right-hand side of your screen. There's an option for questions, and you can click on that to open up a window where you can submit your queries. And with a lot to get through, so I'm going to turn it right over to Patrick to get us started. Patrick, over to you.
Hello, thank you. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Thank you, Tara. So let's start with talking about what mobile attack vectors look like. So in IT, we've been accustomed to defending our desktops, PCs, and our servers for many, many years, but the mobile attack vectors are slightly different. So you now have to start thinking about these websites that people are clicking on their phones, they're installing applications from app stores, they're getting SMS text messages with possible tiny URL links from colleagues or hackers or different sources throughout, and then possibly clicking on them and actually being led to web pages or possible other downloads. Then you walk into a Starbucks, you walk into an airport cafe. Are you really on that Wi-Fi? How do you know for sure that you've connected to a safe and secure thing, or if you're in your hotel? Government organizations care about things like, are you on the right cellular tower, right? Is someone trying to listen in and trying to intercept your call, intercept that actual voice traffic, and possibly do something malicious? And then, of course, possibly somebody comes in, tries to do a Bluetooth-based or near-field communication attack. That's really proximity-based. But let's say the device then becomes infected through one of these means, and then you come into your organization. You join the VPN, you get onto the corporate Wi-Fi, you plug that device through USB into your PC or your Mac. The hackers are starting to listen for those different aspects to possibly come into your organization as well. So thinking about this as these new attack surfaces, how do you actually start trying to address these? And then what are some of the different threats out there, right? You'll hear from our colleagues some other examples, but we're starting to see that there are these different malware and vulnerabilities that are approaching. And this is just a short, small list of what we've seen with some historical ramifications as well. In 2017, we started seeing ransomware on Android. One example was a ransomware that was actually targeting based upon the geographic location of that device. So if you were in the United States, it would pop up an FBI warning saying that the FBI, you need to call the FBI right now because you're doing something malicious. And if you actually did call in, they would ask for Bitcoin, and obviously the FBI wouldn't do something like that. But that same ransomware was then used in Canada. So they looked at the phones in Canada, and a Royal Canadian Mounted Police ransomware screen popped up as well, to kernel privilege escalation attempts, to possibly even opening up SOCs back doors inside and looking for proxies as they come onto your network. And not just on Android, but on iOS, right? Here's some examples. One of the bigger ones that happened a few years ago was the Pegasus Trident. There was actually a Safari-based exploit, a low-level exploit. The attackers were able to send an SMS message to that device. You clicked it, it would start the Safari browser on iOS and then immediately crash. What would the end user do? What would you have done when that happened? What happened in the background was that exploit found targeted vulnerability inside the device, actually then installed surveillance software without you knowing anything was happening on. And we saw people just click that link again, trying to get to that link yet again and again. But by that time, that low-level escalation was already done, that everything that was then typed on that device was then being transmitted to malicious sites. And not only are they attacking the devices, but years ago there was some Chinese attacks based on the Xcode developer platform, where they actually installed and built a maliciously infected Xcode developer set of tools, and they were delivering it to developers all over China. Rather than coming all the way back to the Apple site, they were actually pushing those out to local developers, and those local developers, and everything written with those Xcode Ghost infected platform had malware, over 4,000 apps. Malicious profile attacks as well. So thinking about iOS, as you install a management profile, there's also configuration profiles. But you can see here, there's many different ways that these different attacks can be leveraged. So what do we do about that? And with Gartner, we came up with a mobile security kind of strategy, and there's some pre-work that has to be done. You have to start considering what type of data is actually being installed on the devices. And different levels of data will require different types of tools and technologies and security solutions as you allow those onto the devices. Higher secure data will require additional security practices, tools, configurations. Obviously, then you also have to look at possible business requirements. You may have specific mobile applications that only run on a specific platform as well, carrier. And then we'll quickly talk about mobile education. Many of you, I'm sure, are already doing phishing training for your employees, but we'll talk about how it becomes critical for you to also do mobile security awareness. And then as we go through this, as we go through the strategy, we talk about these different areas. Since we only have a short time, we'll talk about some of the key areas. How do you define the right minimum OS and hardware versions? We'll talk about mobile threat defense as a new set of tools that are coming out there to give you kind of advanced mobile security above and beyond what the operating systems might have. And that gets into application security, network security, device protection security as well. And then we'll give you an example of how all this kind of looks together. Now, let's look at this example, and there's many out there. I just picked one that comes up a lot. This is a flashlight app in the Android marketplace, and there's examples of this all throughout both iOS and Android. This flashlight app is yearly updated. You can see here it's a 4.6 rated, 200,000 reviews on this device, and this is a flashlight app. We all know that all of our mobile devices today, any modern mobile device today has a flash. You turn it on right inside the operating system. But this particular author has created some of these variety of lighting. It does SOS, it does music, it does all these different fanciful things. But let's look at what this particular application has access to after you install it. I'm going to read this for those of you that might not be able to see it. Updates to flashlight may automatically add any additional capabilities within that list on the right. Can any of you tell me why a flashlight app needs anything more than access to the flash? You can see here on the right, this app could, it doesn't mean it's turned on by default, but could at any time ask for and turn on access to your phone, access to your file system, access to the Wi-Fi, to your pictures, to your video. And most of our employees today will just install this because it's got a high set of ratings, it's downloaded by everybody out there. Think about this as you train your employees. Why does that app need that privilege? rather than the employees are just trying to get the latest and greatest app. And is it actually coming from the real source as well? So does something need GPS access? Does something need access to each of these individual things? Now, there's nothing malicious about this particular app at this point in time. Google scanned it through their Play Protect, and this particular author hasn't done anything malicious with it. But this is something that you have to start considering as you train your employees. They need to be aware. They need to think about what they're installing on that device, because it could at some point in time later have possible ramifications for your enterprise. Now, we do a year-over-year kind of comparison as we look at the different mobile operating systems. We're in the process of doing the 2019 update, but here's the current one. The 2019 update will come out later next month. But you need to start thinking about starting with a core base operating system and a core set of hardware that meets a minimum bar. Think about the devices that you allow onto your network today. If it's below 6.0, and it says current monthly Android security patch, the January 2018 security patch actually had the Spectre and Meltdown fixes. So you shouldn't allow anything underneath 6.0 and at least last year's January patch. And you can see here on the right, there's some additional recommendations on hardware as well. And Google, Mike will talk a little bit more about this in his section, but Google has taken their Pixel devices, added some additional capabilities above and beyond their common definition requirements, and added additional security. Samsung Knox has government grade security. BlackBerry Android and the Google Android Enterprise Recommended program is pushing the bar and adding additional, more hardware-based, software-based, higher requirements to meet enterprise security standards. On iOS 11.2, because that's where their Spectre and Meltdown fixes, and with the iPhone 5S, and you can see the iPad Air equivalents, that's when they added their hardware-based security called the Secure Enclave, where they start storing keys into that. Helps with some of the kernel mode protections as well. And then as you're looking at Windows as a Surface tablet, kind of bring your own device, we're recommending Windows 10 fall creators from in the past, which is 1709, and obviously the current Windows updates as well. So these are the devices that at a minimum should be your requirements for all BYOD and corporate managed devices coming into your organization. Now let's talk about that. After you've set the baseline, what do we need to look at for possible higher sets of security practices above and beyond that? A few years ago, mobile threat defense architecture, or mobile threat defense vendors came out with this additional layer of security. So your employees will install an MTD agent on the device. It will provide application layer protection. So what they've done is gone out and done static and dynamic analysis of the mobile applications, looked at those above and beyond, looked at when some authors are trying to update or make changes, out of band through web service connections. They look to ensure to see if you're on that right Wi-Fi. Obviously, as attackers are trying to do pineapple-based attacks, they're trying to spoof Wi-Fi's in your local coffee shop or your airport. There are certain indications that could possibly be detected. And then what happens if an application installs through a side load and then tries to instantiate a VPN? Why did that application need it? So that kind of behavioral anomaly kind of detection. And this agent then communicates with the backend cloud service, and then you can manage it that way. And so this is great for a kind of a bring your own device scenario, MTD in what they call standalone mode, right? This doesn't prompt the users to say, I have to accept this, and then like a traditional EMM would require full control, full access, that you could delete data and everything else like that. MTD and standalone doesn't prompt that user to do that. So it's giving them the power and the ability to kind of secure their device, both from a personal side as well as from an enterprise side. Now, once you do add, from a managed perspective, the full unified endpoint management or EMM or MDM solution to it, these controls are more around configuration, policy management, device management. So MTD is the security solution. EMM, UEM, MDM is really more the management solution. But what the MTD vendors have done is they've actually integrated with that. So for your managed devices, you can install the MTD, integrate it with your backend, and then once a threat is detected on the device, since you have that back channel, that integration, you could actually create a policy that says, oh, I see a malicious device or something's going wrong on that, someone's trying to do a man-in-the-middle attack, go ahead and force a VPN or require an uninstall of that application because you have that management channel. Now, there's a lot of different things going on here, but in the beginning, it's really important to make sure you set that minimum platform level that we discussed and start thinking about mobile threat defense as that agent. You deploy endpoints today, and you always deploy some kind of endpoint protection platform or an EDR or some kind of malware on it. So it's starting to become to the same level on mobile devices, needing to have this additional, more advanced kind of security practices. Because think about it, you're using your mobile device first 80 to 90% of the day. So the hackers are also realizing that as well. There's some other capabilities for some organizations we see where if you have line of business applications, actually adding mobile application security, we're actually doing hardening or locking it down or scanning for certain types of APIs and secure coding practices inside the line of business applications. And then from a management perspective, bringing that UEM, EMM, MDM on there to give you that configuration management and control aspect. But then in the end, that training, that education becomes so critical. People are aware of what they need to do for emails, but even email phishing goes through. But think about all the different things they do on their device today. And that device has corporate data as well as personal data. So as you reach out through the education programs inside your organizations, talk about it that way. You're not only helping them to be more secure because their banking data is on there, you're also helping them be more secure with the enterprise data that's on those devices as well. And so the culmination of this strategy that we've, this Gartner security strategy that we've built looks like this. And these are some examples of how you can actually start. And it goes back to that first part of the discussion that I was talking about. Depending upon the level of data that's on that device, you may have more requirements. As we talk to clients all the time, everyone's saying, my CEO wants that latest and greatest device. Well, it depends on what that CEO needs on that device. If he needs corporate sensitive, very critical data, you can give him a table like this and says, fine, if you need that sensitive data, here's the security requirements. So you're not saying, no, he can't have that greatest, latest large screen, foldable screen phone that just comes out, but you're giving him some prescriptive guidance on what. If he just wants email, calendar contacts, some low sensitive data, you could look at the bottom line and get him quickly on board, getting access to his email, but still protecting your corporate resources. And so this menu that you build allows to handle BYOD to fully managed and everything in between. And these are recommendations as based on it. And you can change, obviously, the data classifications, but looking at the operating system separate from the EMM, possibly looking at containers. Do you need to have a container for separating the personal data from the corporate data? Device level, app level, or container level VPNs, looking at mobile threat defense, looking at hardening those corporate applications. And the other thing that quickly to touch on in a quick story, device authentication versus the corporate container segment authentication. I talked to a CISO recently, and his CIO took his corporate-owned iPad device home and registered his entire family's fingerprints on that device. So that iPad in this particular case became that family use thing, but it had corporate data on it. So thinking about, and this is not just an iPad thing, but anything that has biometrics, there's no way to really detect. So thinking about the personal side, device authentication, different than having to get into the corporate container, that corporate application, having separate authentication methods so you can make sure that at least that device is not just getting unlocked, it's seamless access into your corporate information. And of course, encryption both at a device level and a file level. And then as you start getting into higher sensitive data and use cases, and possibly even looking at doing full, voice, LTE, SMS, and data end-to-end encryption for your mobile strategy. And with that, quickly, just running through some of the different recommendations, we all need to start looking at the risk and the tactics that are being happened. So you have people that are looking at threats today for your endpoints and your servers. You need to start thinking about looking at the endpoints and the mobile devices in that same kind of threat hunting. Setting that minimum OS, and you can see here for BYOD, obviously you might not have full control of the EMM, but trying to verify what actually is installing. So Google, Apple, Microsoft have done a good job about vetting the applications that go into their app stores, but the ones that are going into those non-third-party app stores where the process of vetting the applications is not as good becomes important. Looking at mobile threat defense solutions, and then adaptive access-based state of control. So thinking about if that MTD detects that device is high risk possibly, then removing them from access from your cloud, your corporate information through a manual process, and then deliver training. Now the only quick change is between that and corporate manage is once you have the EMM on there, you can actually enforce which applications are being installed and from what sources. And then with the mobile threat defense, looking at that integration between MTD and EMM gives you kind of complete control of the security and the management of that device. And with that, I will pass it over to David Richardson.
Thank you, Patrick. That was very informative. And I'm going to follow up on some of those items and go a little bit deeper into a couple of specific threats. First, let me get started by just explaining a little bit of what's changed in the landscape in the last couple of years that's brought us to this point of post-perimeter security. So your data no longer resides within your four walls, within your own data center. Your data is in the cloud. It is no longer within your physical perimeter, but is also no longer within your digital perimeter of firewalls, secure web gateways, access gateways, things like that. This data, is up there in the cloud, and you fetch it directly from cloud service providers. Your users have gone mobile at the same time, and so these mobile devices can connect to any network, and they can access that data that's in the cloud from anywhere. So essentially, your corporate network is now the Starbucks Wi-Fi. Any hotel Wi-Fi or home Wi-Fi anywhere in the world, these are how your employees are getting work done. They're connecting to these networks. And so essentially your perimeter has disappeared. All the controls that you previously built into your network, your VPN, your physical infrastructure, they no longer apply in this new world of mobile plus cloud delivered software. So in this new perimeterless world, there's a couple of things that you need to think about how to do differently. One, you can't trust the devices accessing your data. Just because a device is able to enter in a username and password and get on your network or get into try to access a cloud service doesn't mean that this device should be trustworthy. Furthermore, bad actors know that users are no longer being protected by your perimeter, so they know which devices to target. They know to target your mobile devices for a variety of reasons. And to make things even more complicated, end users are increasingly demanding privacy free from inspection of their content on their mobile devices. And no matter how locked down a corporate device you issue to someone, every single mobile device is inherently a mix of personal and corporate. There's various percentages depending on how you lock it down. But if you think about it, your mobile device, even if it's fully corporate device, it knows where you are 24/7. That's personal data. Your camera roll is most likely a mix of personal data, photos of your family, and work data, photos of sensitive whiteboards with IP information on them. So these devices are inherently a blend of personal and corporate. And so your traditional security approaches don't apply. And in this new perimeterless world, you need to do things a little bit differently. You need to move some of the critical perimeter security services that you used to rely on to the endpoint or to an identity and access management solution or to the cloud service providers directly. And your access to your data must be based on a continuous assessment of trust from an assumption of zero trust. So just because a device has the right username and password doesn't mean that that's a device that complies with your corporate policies and should be allowed to access that data. You need to basically assume that all devices should be untrusted by default until you've confirmed that that device is trustworthy. So there's really three pillars of the way that we look at post-perimeter security, at least here at Lookout. In post-perimeter security, you may have also heard of other terms like, zero trust or beyond core. These are all very similar concepts. Post-perimeter security is about enabling those types of architectures. So basically, there's three main components that you need to think about here. There's the endpoint itself, but whether that's a mobile endpoint or IoT device or a traditional desktop endpoint. There are the cloud services that it accesses, and there is the identity solution that allows you to identify who is who. Those services all need to be in communication with each other through a system called continuous conditional access. They need to all be able to share data with one another about the current health status of this endpoint, this identity associated with accessing this data, and the data itself from the cloud service provider's perspective. And they need to be able to determine whether or not this endpoint with this identity should be able to access that cloud resource. And the continuous part here is crucial. If something changes to the risk posture of this device or the identity or the resource that you're trying to reach out to, you need to be able to cut off access in real time. You need to not just, not allow the user to log in the next time that they're trying to access something from an insecure device. You need to actually cut them off in real time. So here at Lookout, we're a mobile threat defense vendor. So we focus mostly on the mobile endpoint. So I'm going to talk about the mobile endpoint for a second and some of the threats that we're seeing there. So first of all, why target mobile? Patrick covered a lot of this already, but if you think about it, if you could only have one device that belongs to someone, the mobile device would be the perfect device for you to hack because it's always connected to the internet. It's got microphones, it's got cameras, it's got corporate data on it, it's got your location, it's got your passwords and your multi-factor authentication token. So if you could just compromise one device, this is the perfect one to do. So if you think about, I'm protecting my devices with multi-factor authentication, this is the one device where someone is going to type in their username, their password, and their multi-factor authentication token, all from the same device. So if you could just watch what was going on that one device, you would have all the keys that you need to compromise that user and access any data that they have access to. So at Lookout, as we were thinking about, as you enable more productivity for mobile devices, what are the risks that you need to be aware of? We created something called the Mobile Risk Matrix. And I'm not going to walk through this like square by square here, but at a high level, you need to think about the four various vectors, the apps that are on those devices, the device itself, the OS version, the way it's configured, the hardware manufacturer, et cetera, the security patch level, the networks that device connects to, whether that be Wi-Fi, cellular, VPN networks, proxies, et cetera, and the web and content that device consumes, such as phishing attacks and things like that. And then across each of these vectors, you need to be worried about three different components of risk. You need to be worried about threats. Obviously, you need to be worried about malware or rooted and jailbroken devices, man-in-the-middle attacks, phishing sites, et cetera. But you also need to be worried about software vulnerabilities that are introduced by out-of-date applications, out-of-date operating systems, vulnerable SDKs, things like that. And you need to be worried about the behavior and configurations of each of these things and how they relate to your corporate policies. So here's where, apps that are collecting way too much data, that flashlight app that is, harvesting all this data from your device potentially, or that's over permission that you need to worry about there, or, devices that are configured in an insecure manner, such as, the sharing of passcodes or having no passcode, or allowing installation from third-party app stores. So I'm going to dive into just a couple of threat examples in a few of those boxes there, and cover some interesting trends we're seeing. So one trend that we're seeing is we're actually seeing phishing sites that are exclusively targeting mobile, that are built to target mobile. So here is an example of a WhatsApp campaign that we've seen spreading around. This is just one variant of it, but basically a WhatsApp account of someone in your address book would get compromised, and they would send you this message. So it would come from a trusted source. You would know the sender. And it would look like a pretty compelling normal link. And if you click on that link on a mobile device, you would get a phishing page. And if you were to click on that link on a non-mobile device, you would actually get the real website that it was trying to point you to. So there's this is a case where the attacker has actually decided, I want to only target the mobile users. This technique actually allows these types of sites to go undetected for longer, because many of the tools that are trying to detect phishing sites are being fooled by this simple thing of redirecting them to the real site in that case. Here, if you just look very closely, you might have noticed it, but there's a tiny dot underneath this A. That is called a homoglyph attack, where basically it looks the same to the naked eye as the real URL, but that's actually to a computer. That's a completely different Unicode character, sends you to a completely different server. And we've seen a lot of attacks like that coming up. We've also seen a lot of mobile malware as a service campaigns. So attacks where you can actually essentially just buy malware that will target a specific account type. And that malware will be high quality, and it will be branded to look exactly like the real thing. And this threat, Bonkamar Stealer, the way that it works is it looks at what app is running in the foreground on your device, and it presents a pop-up on top of that application when the target app is running. So you open your Capital One app, and suddenly a second app creates a pop-up on top of it that looks exactly like a Capital One login page. And user is easily tricked by that to type in their username and password. They click sign in, and they go back into the Capital One app like they were before, not realizing that they were just phished in that process. And then another interesting trend is proxy malware that we're seeing. So we're seeing malware that will actually open up SOX proxies on devices that get infected and allow attackers to have access to any of the networks that that device can connect to. So you might have someone who downloads malware at home in their free time, and then they go and they connect their device to a work network. And now the owner of this proxy malware will sell to the highest bidder access into that corporate network and access into that device that's associated with that corporate network. And so I just want to leave you with two thoughts here, again, about what you need to do as a result of this. You need to think about your long-term strategy as it relates to the perimeter around your data crumbling, and figure out where you need to move these critical perimeter services. Our recommendation is that a lot of these need to move to the endpoint, but there are other places that they can move, such as the identity and access management solution and the cloud provider as well. And the combination of those is the best approach. And you need to start not assuming that you should trust your devices by default. And so with that, I am going to hand things off to my colleague Mike here.
Great. Thanks, David and Patrick. Let's see here. Pop this in. All righty. Well, thanks again, everyone, for allowing me the opportunity to join today. I think to set the stage, I want to talk first about a couple of things, and then we'll jump into some of what I see and what we see here at Google, and particularly on the Android team. What we see as far as what we call misperceptions, and then also one of the bigger things is around, how do we manage Android devices efficiently? So one of the first things that we, that we like to talk about is obviously that there's a lot of Android devices on the planet, right? On a rolling 30-day schedule, we see roughly 2.3 billion Android devices checking into Google Play services. And those are obviously devices that have Google services. There could be more. The other part of the ecosystem is most people think that Android is just for smartphones and potentially tablets, right? But I think what we were seeing over the last few years, due to some things like Windows Mobile, kind of going out of favor and being deprecated by Microsoft, is that Android is actually landing on a lot of other pieces of hardware. So there are a ton of these devices out there. And the good news is that, we have a way to manage these, that we've removed that management fragmentation and done a lot of things over the past several years. to help secure those devices and deploy them and manage them in a very secure way. So, one of the areas where I like to kind of get into it is what I called in the beginning is what we call misperceptions. So, really, it all started when a couple of years back, I think people just stopped looking at Android as a viable enterprise platform for various reasons. However, over the last couple of years, we've done a lot in the ecosystem, and asking of our ecosystem to make these things, these Android devices and the platform, everything that runs on them and what they run on, secure. So I think one of the couple of areas are, the updates are slow. That's kind of a misperception in the modern Android world. People also think, and customers also think, that a vulnerability equals an exploit. That is not true. A vulnerability is a chance, and an exploit is writing code and getting it onto a device to expose that chance. So I think there's a big delineation there to understanding that just because there's a chance doesn't mean anything is going to happen. And in fact, history shows us that most times with the major issues, things really never come to fruition as far as a vulnerability being exploited en masse in the wild. The second piece is around harmful apps, right? Here at Google, we call that potentially harmful apps. And the perception that Google Play is full of malware. We've actually done a very good job, and the ecosystem helps us with that as well. So we'll jump into a few things here to kind of to move forward. But for as far as Android patching goes, this is pretty impressive, and I think this is a good key indicator of the devices are getting patched very regularly, right? So we introduced something called Project Treble a year or two ago, which actually helps the ecosystem, software on chip manufacturers, OEMs, and carriers get updates out faster. It interjects a hardware abstraction layer that makes developing these updates much faster. So in 2018, we actually saw just over 1 billion of those devices getting regular updates. And regular, I mean within 90 days of Google releasing those 30-day patches. And then 84% of devices at the end of last year were getting 84% more devices quarter over quarter were getting updates regularly than a year ago. So we are seeing this trend change primarily because we're driving the ecosystem, mainly OEMs and carriers, to accept those security updates and making it easier for them to do so. Again, back on the story of where vulnerability doesn't necessarily mean an exploit. I'm not saying that they're not there. However, in the various layers of the Android operating system, and including the hardware, we've actually made introduced a lot of technical best practices in the operating system and the platform that mitigate, even when an exploit does get onto a device, what it can actually get to. In fact, if you really think about the whole broad picture of Android security, the concept now is that getting a true piece of malware on a managed Android device is pretty rare. And then if it does get on there, does it really get to your credit card data? Does it really get to, really critical information? Or maybe it gets your contacts. Again, the risk posture there, it depends on what vertical you're in and what kind of things you're doing. But the idea here is that we have so many techniques and outside the scope of this discussion that you can actually see is in the operating system, I should say modern Android. And it all starts with secure hardware. Some of these things that you're seeing on this screen, I won't go through them in great detail. However, some of the things we've asked and actually mandated that the OEM and carrier ecosystem do is start building secure hardware into the devices. In fact, in Oreo, it is mandated that devices come out of the box with a secure hardware component. And that provides a lot of these things that even if a device is compromised, you can still very strongly attest that the integrity of the device is preserved. And with these particular components here, again, this helps with deploying devices in the enterprise, because all these things help you prevent allowing bad actors and even malware from taking data off of a device. And finally, on the PHA side, we at Google call PHAs potentially harmful applications, but it's really important to understand that a PHA does not in any way, shape, or form equal malware. It does not equal Trojan. There's all kinds of things that can get on the device. As my colleagues mentioned, screen overlays which you can now control with modern management capabilities, are just one way, and that's categorized as like click fraud or screen capturing or clickbait. Real malware on Google Play is pretty small. In fact, the whole PHA category is at the end of last year was down to 0.042%, which is actually pretty darn good. And you can see the blue line at the top there is going down on devices that are loading applications outside of Google Play, i.e. side loading. And one of the reasons for that is just because we've strengthened the operating system so that exploits are much harder to actually enable. Now, some of the other pieces, and this is the big part because we're here in an enterprise stance, in an enterprise discussion, one of the biggest things we see is that many customers are still managing Android devices with legacy methods. And device administrator is just not the way to manage Android any longer. We want customers to start using modern Android under the Android enterprise components. So when you're using legacy management, you can see here on this screen, there's a lot of problems that come out as far as being able to manage that device. And with the new modern management, you have tons of knobs and levers that can actually help you mitigate that, right? So what at Google do we think the best practices are to help you safeguard Android devices? And the number one thing is awareness. And you've heard it from my colleagues, my friends here on the call. You've got to educate your users, right? Because no matter how good you think you are, they being bad actors, will always find a way to try and trick people. Social engineering and phishing is the number one way. So you need to educate your users. And the other way is to start adopting modern Android management. Now, one of the ways to do that, obviously from a Google perspective, is to use devices and services that are on the Android Enterprise recommended site. Patrick mentioned that earlier, and that's a good way to understand and know that you're getting devices that have a long runway, so you can select with confidence, you know, that these devices will give you consistent deployment and they will get regular updates, and that is under contract by those devices. And then your EMM partners and your managed solutions providers are also recommended. So when you combine all that together, and then you look at our partners in the ecosystem like Lookout and some of the other security vendors out there, when you couple all that together and use those protections and use those tools, Androids can be managed in a very, very secure method. So one of the other things that I mentioned earlier was using modern Android management, and that's under the guise of Android Enterprise. Patrick mentioned it earlier, is going away from containers and potentially start to look at what we call profiles that are based on Linux profiles on these devices. So using these modern management tools, you can actually mitigate a lot of the attack vectors that are posed by these type of attacks, just because you have the tools to actually control the ways that they get on a device. One of the best ways is to use a strong Play Store, and I think my colleagues would agree that installing your apps through managed Google Play and not side loading and not using third-party app stores is the actual best way to do it. When you use managed Google Play, you get all kinds of benefits. You can't have apps get on that device outside of management. There's no option for a user to sideload an app in any way, shape, or form. So by controlling that, and then by layering on some threat detection, you actually can control what gets on the device and what goes off the device as far as data. And you can do that with third-party components. But the idea here is use modern management. Move away from device administrator because that's too open. And that's this statement that I want to make here, is device admin has been deprecated, or I should say has started being deprecated way back in NuGot a few years back. And we announced that in December of 2017. All device administrator APIs have been marked as deprecated in PI. Now that does close up a lot of attack vectors based on APIs and things of that nature. And basically by the time Q rolls out, whatever dessert name that's going to be, device administrator APIs will be no more. So it behooves you to start migrating your fleets over and managing them with Android Enterprise components or modern Android. And then finally, I think one of the greatest things about Android, is that we have what we call an ecosystem of just really phenomenal security defenders. My colleagues here on the phone, Patrick for education, and David for the products that they build. Combine that with all the entities that you see here. Many people say that Android is open, that's bad. We don't see it that way. Because it's open, you have choice. It's not fragmented anymore. And because we have all these different entities that are banging away to make Android secure, I'd argue it's one of the securest. Of course, with that said, I think it's good to note that we have a good system, we have a good ecosystem, and many partners that that actually make the system that much better. So with that, I'll go ahead and pass the ball back over to Tara to close up, and maybe we'll do some Q&A.
Great, thank you so much, Mike. And yes, I know that we got started a little bit on the later side, but I think we do have time for a few questions. So, let's kick it off. I think you guys all gave us a lot to think about. Let's look towards the future a little bit with an eye towards the past. If we look at the most significant ways that enterprise mobile security has changed in the past 5 years, I'm curious as to what you guys say that those would be. And then also, do you feel as though there have been any surprising developments within that time frame, and what does that hold for the future? And maybe Patrick, maybe if you want to start us off with your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, definitely, as I was saying earlier, that the mobile device is your primary device, right? And we really need to start looking at it as a full-fledged endpoint. And and that's where some of the endpoint protection platforms have been integrating with the mobile threat defense vendors and giving you a holistic look across all devices, be it a laptop, a Chromebook, an iPad, a Surface, a iOS device, an Android device, and start thinking about if something gets compromised, if your phone gets compromised, what's next? What is the hacker going to then possibly do? Thinking about what cloud applications you might be accessing as well. So I think that's probably the biggest thing we're seeing, and IT organizations are starting to staff that up as well, bringing that mobile security discipline integrated with their traditional endpoint protection capabilities.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks. And David or Mike, would either one of you like to weigh in on that?
Sure, I'll add a little bit there. So I think one of the surprising things that I've seen is just kind of what's forcing adoption of enterprise mobile security. So one of the main things that we see is that it's actually geared around a project around enabling mobility usually. So for example, an organization is rolling out, say, G Suite or Office 365 to all of their devices, and they're realizing that in that process, they're opening up their mobile devices to access more data than they did before. So it's kind of interesting to see how actually enabling mobility is one of the significant drivers for when organizations decide we need to have a more comprehensive mobile security strategy, as a result. Got it.
Okay, great. And David, we actually have another question for you from the audience. Allison would like to know if you could expand a little bit on the concept of secure SMS and how it works or would work.
Secure SMS. So obviously the current ways that SMS are delivered are, they weren't built with security in mind. And, it was a way to broadcast messages out, quite broadly and without necessarily encryption or some of those other things together. Obviously, there's a bunch of user experience issues with SMS as well, character size or like character limits and read receipts and those types of things that many different players have been trying to expand upon that. So I think that I think SMS as a whole in its current form will shrink in terms of usage. Obviously, it's already being replaced by whether it's WhatsApp or Google Hangouts or iMessage or other methods like that. So as far as the idea of secure SMS, I think that there's obviously a lot of trends. I'm assuming secure SMS would be, encrypted SMS messages, end-to-end encrypted SMS messages. Obviously, there's a lot of debate about this at the moment in terms of what should and shouldn't be done, from an encryption perspective. I obviously don't want to kind of talk too much about that, but it is interesting how how there's been a whole bunch of tools that have sprung up lately that are enabling end users to form their own fully end-to-end encrypted conversations, which has obviously lots of applications for political dissidents, as well as insider trading and other things like that. So I think that's going to be a really kind of difficult topic that we're going to have to wrestle through in the next couple of years here.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay. We have another question from the audience that's about basically denial of service. They're asking, for very critical applications, should enterprises be concerned about deliberate jamming and not just spoofing and sniffing?
Yeah, so I think yes. Obviously, as you enable users to do more from mobility, it may become a critical part of your workflow, as critical as your cloud services being operational, that your mobile applications are operational and that people are able to get work done as a result of that.
Okay, and then we have a question for Mike. So, if someone is using Android Enterprise and they are using it in device owner mode and everything's been restricted to Google Play, they're wondering if there is a need or a benefit to layer on third-party security solutions in that scenario.
Well, again, that always comes down to the risk posture and what your risk appetite and your mean time for failure is. I think that's an individual decision. We at Google will never say not to use it. There's obviously lots of things in the platform that protect the device, but that's what it does. It protects the device. So while things can still get onto devices, it's depending on your use case and depending on what the device is being used for, how many applications are on it, is it special purpose, is it shared? You have to take into consideration the full picture. One would argue if it's fully managed and it's in kiosk mode and there's no way to get apps on there, do you need some sort of external, or some other service? Maybe, maybe not, because you might want to protect the data that's going to it, right? I think at Google, we look at it from a perspective of trying to keep exploits in any way, shape, or form off a device, but we're not protecting the networks per se, other than guaranteeing that we're using the proper certificates and modern TLS or more advanced TLS connections. So really, again, it boils down to, the use case and what your risk posture is.
Okay, great. Okay, and Patrick, so another question that we had is, if you're an end user, an employee, what part does sort of end user awareness play in this? For instance, is using my phone with as a second factor of authentication, is that a safe practice? What about using a VPN while I'm on public Wi-Fi? Does that protect me from some of those threats? What are your thoughts on that?
Right. I mean, definitely we're starting to see a lot of the cloud service providers, recommending multi-factor authentication. The challenge with that is, the attacks for your device as a second factor are, is there any risky applications on there? Have I actually, done that self-awareness, and am I actually policing my own device on and putting only safe applications on there? So like MTD and standalone could help with that. Or the other things we see is, for government high risk, devices, some of the threat issues we look at is, has someone cloned my phone as well, right? So if you're starting to look at your bill and all of a sudden you see a whole bunch of different phone calls or things like that that might be, happening, that, that could, indicate someone might have gone that. But that's a very targeted, very personal attack. So it gets back to, you have to understand the health of your device to make it, to be okay to be used as a second factor of authentication. And the second part of that question was a mobile VPN. Definitely, it's going to help, right? If you are on that Starbucks Wi-Fi or the airport Wi-Fi or whatever, having that VPN will definitely secure, the traffic. A lot of security-minded professionals are paying for always on VPN, so they have that additional layer of protection. So even if someone is trying to do a man-in-the-middle attack at some kind of coffee shop, that you at least have that encryption. And that's also gets back to the corporation. So if you have higher sensitive data on that device, possibly instantiating that VPN on that managed device is definitely a good best practice for protecting the network stack.
Got it.
Hey, I want to add one thing at the end there. I agree with what Patrick's saying, but one thing that I want to caution is be careful about what VPN you're using.
Right.
There are a lot of free VPNs out there. If it's a free VPN, it is impossible for someone to pay for the cost to run a free VPN without somehow monetizing your data. And we're seeing VPNs get built into applications, such as the Dolphin browser, having built-in VPNs. These types of things create risks associated with the device as well, and they're also an avenue for man-in-the-middle attacks. We've actually seen VPNs that are better than free, where they pay users. I mean, there was a high-profile example recently of Facebook offering to pay, I think it was teenagers, like $20 a month if they would turn on an always-on VPN so that Facebook could watch all of their traffic. But we've seen that as a trend for a long time, and that is actually a source of man-in-the-middle, a source of enterprise data getting accidentally flowing through, a third-party advertiser in a way that it really should not.
Yeah, Tara, real quick, I'd like to add one more thing to this. We at Google actually take another approach that seems to work extremely well, and it's not only about authenticating who you are and protecting that authentication with two-factor, but it's also about trust level. So there's all kinds of signals that come from your device. So when you make a connection to a resource, there's services, not necessarily network access control, but trust models. At Google, we call it Beyond Corp. So looking at signals about the device, where you are, the type of cert, do you have a machine cert or do you have a user cert? And all these different various signals from a device will give you a trust level. And then that will only allow access to certain resources in your network. So when you combine all three of those together, that's kind of what we do at Google, and it really works quite well. So that's a strategy that we've seen some enterprises start to adopt.
Yep, absolutely
Okay,
agree there.
Yeah, agreed.
Great. Okay, guys, well, I want to wrap it up. We did have one more question from the audience, though, that I think is probably worth asking. This person would like to know, in terms of advanced persistent threat activity, nation-state activity, corporate espionage, that type of thing, how common is that? How much should enterprises have to worry about that type of activity?
Tara, I can speak from the Android perspective. I don't have specific data. I'll say it happens. I would say that, again, going back to my part of the presentation, what we've done in the ecosystem is actually hardened and even made it much more difficult, even for OEMs and carriers, to inject malware or bad pieces of data into the system partition. Some of the things that we look at when we certify a device are things like that, and then putting things into the platform itself actually mitigate that sort of attack. And then with remote attestation services, things like verified boot, we can very strongly attest that the system partition will be intact when the device is under management. There's all kinds of signals that we can look at that are based on hashing and remote attestation that can strongly attest that a system partition is truly has not been compromised. So while I say it hasn't been tried, I'm sure it has, but we don't. From my perspective, I don't see it. But that's not to say that it doesn't happen.
Got it.
Yeah.
DR, did you have any further thoughts on that?
Yeah, just a couple of thoughts on that. So one, I'll agree with what Mike's saying about, especially what he was saying earlier about, vulnerability is not an exploit. And these nation state attacks, the ones that we have seen, they are rare and they are newsworthy when they happen. They involve chaining multiple exploits together. So like I'll use a Pegasus example that Patrick mentioned earlier. This involves, a Safari WebKit exploit on a web page, and then chaining to 2 different kernel exploits in order for you to, essentially kind of stealth jailbreak this device and install, hooks on it in order to get persistent access to this device. That's because there are a lot of strong controls, isolation and sandboxing on both iOS and Android, to ensure that just because you've exploited one vulnerability doesn't mean you're going to be able to get full access to the device. You need to chain a number of very expensive vulnerabilities together in order to pull that off. So this does happen. We see it actually. We see it in our user base. Occasionally, it is not something that happens to every enterprise. It's definitely on the rarer side. What we see more often is more like the broad-based attacks where someone will, like the proxy malware I was talking about, where someone will try to target as many users as possible to get them to usually do something that they should know better not to do, like install an app from a third-party source or install a configuration profile or something like that. And get as many users as possible, and then try to figure out, okay, what information can I glean from these users? What corporate data can I exfiltrate, et cetera? We see more of those types of attacks happening.
Really interesting stuff. Thank you, DR. Thank you, Mike Burr. Thank you, Patrick Hevesy. We are going to have to leave it there since we got a little bit of a late start thanks to our technical difficulties, but I would like to thank everybody for attending our webinar. And also wanted to remind everyone that this is being recorded, so you will have an opportunity to go back and review and also share the link with colleagues. That's going to be sent to your email after the event. So feel free to come back and revisit. So thanks, guys. I'd just like to thank our panelists. Thank you so much for participating.
Happy to.
Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. Absolutely. Thanks again.
Have a great afternoon. Bye-bye.